The leaders of the Quad nations have held a hastily arranged meeting to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. The 4 Quad members, Australia, India, the United States and Japan, have drawn much closer in the last few years, in part because of shared anxieties about China's rise and Beijing's increasingly bellicose behavior. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine poses far more difficult questions to the group. First, it's outside the Indo-Pacific, the broad swathe of the globe that the Quad is notionally meant to focus on. Second, there's no easy rapport or converging interests among Quad members when it comes to Russia, which means Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine neatly exposes some of the divisions and limitations of the group. Why call the meeting? The Biden administration pushed for the meeting as part of its global effort to corral both allies and partners to isolate Russia politically and financially in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine. Japan and Australia have swung behind the sanctions campaign, but India has not. Far from it. In fact, New Delhi has not even publicly criticized Russia's invasion. Loading. It has abstained from several key United Nations votes that have overwhelmingly condemned Putin's aggression. And while Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has called for both sides to eschew violence and resume peace talks, it's not clear if he has used his sway with Mr. Putin to press Russia to abandon its invasion. Why doesn't India condemn Russia? There are several reasons. First, India has been scrambling to evacuate more than 15,000 students studying in Ukraine, who are now facing real danger, a first-order responsibility and political priority. In order to do that, it needs Russia's help. But it goes well beyond the students. India has long and deep ties with Russia. Moscow provided crucial military and political support to India during the Cold War, and parts of the Indian military and diplomatic establishment retain lingering fondness for Moscow. And it's not just history. India has active border disputes with both Pakistan and China that can explode into violence at any time, and it still relies heavily on Russia for its military equipment. Some analysts say half of India's weapons and armaments still come from Russia, although it has boosted purchases from other countries, including France, the US and Israel, in recent years. India is also dependent on Russia for crucial energy and military technology, according to Ian Hall from the Griffith Asia Institute. It's not just weapons. There are the nuclear power plants Russia is building in India which it wants for its energy needs, Dr. Hall said. There's the nuclear-powered submarines technology which India is using. Dr. Hall said India will not move sharply away from Russia and towards the West until the US and other countries find ways to help New Delhi find substitutes. It's not unreasonable for them to say, "We have these security concerns and economic concerns. What are you bringing to us?" he said. It sounds mercenary, but it's not completely unreasonable. What are we, Quad nations, willing to do to fill that gap? Do we trust India enough to give them something like that? So did India shift alliances? No. The final leader's statement is very plain diplomatic fare. In fact, it simply said all leaders discussed the crisis in Ukraine and reaffirmed their commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific, in which the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states is respected and countries are free from military, economic, and political coercion. That's boilerplate language. It might gesture very broadly towards shared anxieties that states like China and North Korea might adopt similar tactics to Russia in the future, but there is no unified condemnation of Russia. The word Russia does not even appear, in fact. It's also worth looking at some of the differences between the accounts of the meeting given by all 4 countries. While the Australian, US and Japanese readouts all put a strong emphasis on events in Ukraine, India's readout mentions it more in passing. Developments in Ukraine were discussed in the meeting, including its humanitarian implications. The Prime Minister emphasized the need to return to a path of dialogue and diplomacy, it reads. That's simply a repetition of what senior Indian diplomats and officials have said for months, as they tried to negotiate a difficult tripwire without endangering ties with either Russia or the US. Does this mean it was a waste of time? Not necessarily. It's no secret that there's deep disappointment in Washington, as well as in Tokyo and Canberra, that India is treading so cautiously and has been so unwilling to spend any of its diplomatic capital with Moscow. But the Biden administration was not really expecting India would turn on a dime on Russia after one Quad meeting, and both the US President and Scott Morrison seem to have decided it would be counterproductive to publicly badger India on the subject. The Biden administration's Aishat Shah, Kurt Campbell, has also made it clear that Washington is willing to play the long game. At least for now. We understand India's historic, long-standing relationship with Russia, but at the same time, ultimately, we believe that India will be moving in our direction, he said. Japan and Australia have swung behind Mr. Biden's sanctions campaign, but India has not. Supplied. Dr. Hall said it was noteworthy that the meeting happened at all, particularly given the short notice and the enormous sensitivity of the subject discussed. He said that showed the US still sees the Quad as a top-shelf priority, while all four nations were increasingly confident to use it as a forum for critical discussions. There is enough trust and confidence in the Quad now to quickly meet, with little notice. There is more flexibility now, he said. He said few experts, or diplomats, would have expected India's position to shift radically at such short notice, even given the vast geopolitical upheavals of the last week. I don't think we can assume the purpose of the meeting was to browbeat the Indians. If that was the case, the Indians wouldn't have agreed to attend, he said. If that's the test we are putting on the meeting, that's unfair. Instead, it seems more likely that the US and others hope to use the meeting to chip away at India, in part by arguing that the invasion sets a dangerous precedent that could embolden another great authoritarian power that sits just to India's north. What's the message to China? On the one hand, China might well take heart from the Quad's inability to reach any sort of common cause on Ukraine. It was a powerful reminder that there are limits to the strategic partnership and a real divergence in some core interests. After all, if India was unwilling to even issue a joint statement criticizing a vast and shockingly violent invasion launched by an irredentist power in Europe, what are the chances it would be willing to put any real skin in the game in Asia? But in the end, the situations in Asia and Europe are vastly different and cannot easily be compared. Just for a start, India's relationship with China is nothing like its relationship with Russia. The differences rapidly multiply from there, even with a cursory examination. Still, officials and politicians in Canberra, Tokyo, New Delhi, and in Washington know that China will be watching the US-led response to the war in Ukraine very closely. Beijing has vowed to take Taiwan by force, if necessary, and it will be eyeing the costs imposed on Russia and the breadth of the coalition that Washington can string together. And Scott Morrison clearly sees at least some loose parallels between events in Ukraine and the delicate balance in Asia. We cannot allow what is happening in Ukraine now to ever happen in the Indo-Pacific, Mr. Morrison said after the meeting, in a statement. We are resolute in our commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific region where smaller states do not need to live in fear of more powerful ones. No prizes for guessing which country he is referring to.